Okay, here we go.
Are you going to facilitate it, like introduce us, or should we just jump in?
I can introduce you, whichever one is easier for you.
Will there be live people attending, or it's not live?
It's live. Mm-hmm. So we have some people joining right now, actually.
Great.
Hello, everybody. We'll just give it a couple minutes to let everybody get in and give additional people more time to join. We're going to start in about 1 minute. Okay, I think this is enough time. We can have more people join as we go. So hello, my name is Frances Gonzalez, and I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications for the Lifeline and Vibrant Emotional Health. Tom Shukis couldn't be here today to help facilitate, so I'm here in his stead, and I'm really happy to be here for that, because then I get to introduce our great panelists for today. So we have Chris Bright, the Director of Public Training for the Trevor Project, as well as Tia Dole, the Chief Clinical Operation Officer for the Trevor Project as well. And they're here to do a really great presentation on LGBTQ youth and suicide, including best practices. So welcome, and I'll pass it over to you guys.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Should I start, Chris?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, great. So as was mentioned, my name is Tia Dole. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Chief Clinical Operations Officer at the Trevor Project. I'm also a clinical psychologist by training. And go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, my name's Chris Bright. I'm the Director of Public Training and Education here at the Trevor Project. My job is to facilitate trainings like this that you all are attending, also to do training sort of across the country for youth serving professionals or people who sort of need to know more about how to better serve LGBTQ folks.
Great. You can go ahead and advance. This is going to be interesting for us toggling. We haven't done this virtually yet.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So we're going to cover our 2019 national survey, and Tia's going to go over a lot of this information with you all and give you a little more details on just what that survey was. We're going to talk about language that's important for establishing rapport with LGBTQ folks, best practices that are sort of common amongst LGBTQ folks in crisis, and then resources, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. There's a chat feature on here. If you have questions, you can park them in there as we go, and we'll get to them when we can. But before we start, we want to make sure that you understand this is only the beginning. We have like an hour together today. There's no way an hour is enough time to cover even a fraction of this content thoroughly. And so you are going to have to say to yourself, wow, that's something I know I need to learn more about. And then in your personal time, sort of follow up on resources and things that might be available to learn more about these topics. And we'll give you some of those for sure. And there won't be a 1 hour live Q&A session later because we're just having the Q&A right at the end of this. All right, Tia, you take it away.
Great. We actually last year conducted the largest survey of LGBTQ youth ever conducted. So we had over 34,000 individuals between the ages of 13 and 24 responded. And actually, one of the most important things about our survey is that folks were not given an incentive to complete it. They completed it on their own. It actually took a lot of effort on our marketing team's part. So shout out to Frances for being a marketing person. It was conducted from February to September. We had an IRB approval. And just for context, we actually are about to launch this year's survey, hopefully to get just as many young people. And actually, we're going to be doing the survey also in Spanish, which I believe is the first time that's ever done on such a large scale. So we're really excited about having a lot more diversity than is usually done in surveys like this with LGBTQ youth. The survey offered us a ton of information about factors facing our youth in this country, including suicides, sadness, hopelessness, discrimination, and there are some things that we thought that you all should know moving forward. Great. So about 40% of LGBTQ youth have considered suicide, seriously considered suicide in the last year. Now, if that doesn't terrify you, it terrifies me, meaning that, you know, literally almost half of the population is at serious risk. And you can see here on the right where you can see it broken down in terms of age and gender identity. And one of the things I want to highlight here is that folks who are in the transgender and non-binary community are even more likely to have seriously considered suicide, meaning 54% of them have seriously considered suicide. And if you look there, the 29% have made an attempt in the last year. That is a staggering number, and we're trying to really understand what we could do to more effectively treat this population. If you see it now broken down by age, it's our young people in our community who have considered it seriously, almost half of them, and 26% having made an attempt in the last year. So when you look at these numbers, I think it's really important to understand that compared to the national average, these are quite high. So in terms of the survey, 71% reported feeling sad or hopeless. 76% felt that the recent political climate impacted their mental health. And just as a side note, the day after the Trump election, which I imagine a lot of folks on this call experienced, our services were inundated with young people. And, you know, when you think about working with the youth, they are very much impacted by the media and news events. So we do tend to see spikes when there are very public school suicides, which I believe is the case on all crisis lines. But our population is very specific, and they're looking at, you know, a YouTube star who might have completed suicide, and it really impacts them. And almost half of the population who responded to the survey received counseling from a mental health professional. Okay, so this is actually, if you think about this in the context of conversion efforts, this is where I want you to think about this, which is 2 in 3 LGBTQ youth reports that someone tried to convince them to change their sexual orientation or their gender identity, meaning someone was like, you know, you should really think about being straight, or you should really not think about not being gender non-binary. And I think it's really important in terms of youth that made an attempt, how that impacts their likelihood to make an attempt. And if we look here, 67% here. And if we look over here on the right, when there's no attempt, they're a lot less likely to make an attempt on their life. Go ahead, Chris. Okay. Okay. So 71% of our youth have reported that they experience discrimination due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. This is particularly troubling because we know that right now, going to the Supreme Court, they're considering a case in which the federal government is allowed to discriminate people based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So this is actually a terrifying prospect for our young people, which is not only do they already experience it when it's not legal, right? But knowing that it could become legal means that their future, getting jobs, going to college, you know, working for the Veterans Office, all those things really limit their potential for future, and also limit their hope and increase their hopelessness. Okay. So most of our young people really feel like they would prefer to reach out to an organization that is specialized in LGBTQ young people. Now, I know that most of you all on this call don't have a specialty in this, but one of the purposes of us talking to you is for you to understand the context for our young people, and also how you could make your organization a little bit more friendly and accessible to our youth. Okay. Chris, do you mind jumping in on this one? Because I think you explained this better than me.
Yeah, so in the national survey, we had more than 100 different responses for sexual orientation, more than 100 different responses for gender identity. And I know that for some of you, you might be like, wait, I thought that we were talking gay, lesbian, and bisexual. What do you mean there are 100 different responses for sexual orientation. And the reality is that young people identify their sexuality in many different ways, as do adults, as do all people within the LGBT community. And we've listed some here as an example. Now, it wouldn't be helpful for me to go through each of these identities and say, this is what a demi-boy is, this is what polysexual means, this is what heteroflexible means. Because if somebody were to present a identity to you, let's say, that you were unfamiliar with, just because I gave you a definition does not actually mean that in the future you will know what that means. The best way to understand what someone's orientation means if they describe it to you, and I mean anything, somebody might say, hey, I'm gay. One way you can respond to that is by saying something like, you know, some people use the word gay to mean different things. Can you tell me when you say that you are gay, what that means for you, right? Same thing if somebody says, hey, I'm polysexual. You know, I've heard that term polysexual before, but some people use it to mean different things. I want to know, when you say polysexual, what does that mean for you? So it's not you being like, what? I've never heard of that before, or something like that. It's you saying, totally valid identity. I just want to hear what it means for you. Do you see how that kind of helps the person feel like, even if you aren't very familiar with the identity, that it doesn't surprise you that they have that identity? And of course, the same thing can be said around gender identity as well. So that's just something I want to flag for you. Obviously, there are hundreds of options here that we won't be able to go through, but a good way to find out what a person means when they say something is to just ask.
I think also just in terms of that, one of the things that I think in terms of the LGBTQ youth is that things change with young people. Things that are used 6 months ago may not be used now. And it's not about being trendy. It's actually and this is just sort of anecdotally, with this young population and young folks nowadays, things move at such a rapid pace that we try not to make assumptions that we know, that we ask actually curious questions that aren't closed-ended questions, and questions that aren't sort of like judgmental, which is like, gosh, you know, and I think, Chris, I love the way you always frame questions, which is like, oh, I know some people use it in different ways. And so to try to be open rather than closed when you're asking them the questions. And I think one of the things that for youth, when you're asking questions about their identity, that you probably do need to know for context is to do so in a way that doesn't close them down and make them feel like, oh gosh, I wish, you know, here's another adult who is clueless. It's okay for you to be clueless, but you can actually be kind around the clueless and be like, listen, and even, you know, saying like, oh, this is actually new information for me. I'm really, the curiosity is the key for young people without judgment. And I think that if you can, you know, balance this, which I hope that a bunch of people on here are potentially clinicians, that balance is the key for working with any type of young person, but in particular for a young person who is living in the middle potentially of Kansas and who's on the internet trying to find people like them who understand them, and they find people online a lot of the times, and it's such an amazing experience for them. So for an adult to be like, oh, that seems like a ridiculous term, or gosh, I've never heard of that before, what is that? Then they feel really crushed as they kind of are exploring their identity. This is longer than I intended to go, Chris.
I mean, if you're going to stand on a soapbox, let it be about normalizing people, because everyone's identity deserves to be validated, period. And in our work, of course, it really deserves to be validated. Okay, so crisis topics on Trevor. Do you want to grab this one?
Yes. So some of the topics, we have this parsed out based on our Lifeline versus digital. And this is just as a fact, which is our trans youth or our gender non-binary youth tend to use digital more than they use Lifeline. And the people who use Lifeline tend to be a little bit older. And so this is sort of where we've been able to gather information based on our case records. And on Lifeline, we tend to ask fewer demographic questions because we don't have like a pre-chat forum. And so this is why these are different. These are different topics based on platform. So on Lifeline, people are talking about mental health problems, relationships, gender identity, coming out, and family. And on our digital, we have mental health problems, coming out, gender identity, relationships, and self-injury. Now, it's interesting when I think about the self-injury portion because it is harder to tell someone on the phone that you've been self-injuring, but it's certainly much easier to type it out because young people tend to get a lot of judgment around it. And so this actually makes sense when you talk about what these two different platforms are like.
Yep. Okay,
Great.
so we talked about some things that might exist within the LGBTQ space. So we know that LGBTQ youth face adversity and are marginalized in their schools, communities, families, social networks, all of that. We also know that there's oftentimes a perceived burdensomeness, this idea that like, I'm a burden to the people around me because they didn't want to be connected to an LGBT person. They didn't want to raise an LGBTQ person. The white picket fence lifestyle that they saw with me marrying someone and having 2.5 kids and a dog, all of that is suddenly out the window because of my identity or whatever. This idea of thwarted belonging, this thing of like, I don't belong to this community anymore. There's no space for me in that community. We also have the minority stress model, which I'll let Tia talk about a little bit if you want to throw in here.
Oh, I think we have the next slide is on it.
Oh, great. So Tia will talk about minority stress model in a minute. And then we also know that LGBT people have a feeling of isolation and oftentimes a lack of access to affirming care. There are places in this country where trans young people can't find trans affirmative care within 400 miles of their house. And that's here in the US. So it's really important that all of these things are acknowledged because they can lead to suicide risk. And that's sort of something that we look at here at Trevor. And I'll flash forward for minority stress with Tia.
Now, and one of the things is when you're gathering information in your risk assessment, the reason why we're including all those things is because some of those things are risk factors. And so we really want to be super clear that these are things that you potentially could be asking about, should be asking about. And I assume that our slides will be available after this so that people can peruse them. But those are factors that increase the risk of suicide. Okay, so I wanted to jump into the minority stress model. And I don't know if people have heard this before or not, but the minority stress model is something that says essentially, now I should preface this by saying, oh, yes, you will. So I'll preface this by saying that stressors are what is a factor in mental health, right? So I think one of the things that I hear sometimes when people are kind of like asking a question like, well, are LGBTQ youth just more likely to have all these issues because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity? Absolutely not. That is not the case. The issue is that the LGBTQ youth have more stress on them, which actually increases their experiences of a negative affect. So for LGBTQ youth, and one also uses this model for people of color, the stressors are unique, they are chronic, and they're socially based, meaning that they're dealing with them every day. They're walking around in the world. And, one of the things I think about is when you have someone who is having a gender expression that is different than what other people perceive and that they're kind of living their life through the world, the amount of risk that this person is taking to be themselves every day is incredible. And the amount of anxiety and stress that they feel of walking through the world or walking through the airport or being stuck in an elevator with someone who might suddenly turn on them is something that we really think about as we're talking to youth. So the reason why I'm stressing this as compared to the other ones is the minority stress model is a really good framework for thinking about young people. So the disparities that we're talking about, this increased stress, this increased likelihood to make an attempt and also have serious consideration is due to homophobia and increased danger. And so if you can incorporate this model and disseminate this information to other folks in your organizations, that would be super helpful for our LGBTQ youth.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about language. So some language basics around gender identity that I want to go over with you. One of these terms is sex assigned at birth. When a baby is born, and oftentimes with today's technology, many months before a baby is born, a doctor is looking for genitals. They are saying, I see a penis or I see a vagina, and I'm going to assign this child a gender, right? We see in pop culture this phenomenon of gender reveal parties, you know, where it's like, here is a cake. And when I cut the cake open, if I dyed it blue on the inside, it's a boy. And Facebook has this weird algorithm where it thinks like, if you ever watch something even one time, it thinks that you love that thing now. And so my Facebook thinks that I love gender reveal videos. And so now every time I scroll through my feed, there's a gender reveal party of like someone hitting a baseball and it blows up and it's pink, or like someone opening a box and pink balloons fly out. And then they pan over to a kid who's like, I wanted a brother. And everyone's mad and so disappointed. And what are they going to do? And that whole thing. Now, I get that in some ways that feels innocent and fun and not necessarily like a big deal. But what you can see when we obsess over the gender of someone long before they ever are even born, we can see that actually the sex assigned at birth and the sort of perceived gender of that person will follow them for the rest of their lives. And there are tangible results to that, right? We see that gender inequality exists in huge ways in our culture and society. You know, it's like 20 or 30 of the Fortune 500 company CEOs are women, right? If you look at even just sort of like how much money a woman makes on a dollar in a sort of capitalistic view, if you look at opportunities in education, all of these things are huge factors, and they're decided sort of from birth. And take all of that onto the side and just forget about if somebody realizes, you know what, my gender identity doesn't even match the sex that I was assigned at birth. And what you see is that we have set everybody up to be so locked in to their identity based on their genitals that when people start to express themselves even a little bit outside of that variable, then society doesn't have room for them. And that's why we see these spikes in suicidal ideation. That's why we see a lot of trauma and crisis associated with having a gender identity that's different than the sex you were assigned at birth. In terms of perceived gender, that's where you see people being like, get out of here, this is the men's room, or you can't come in here, this restroom's only for women. All of those sort of spaces and culture, society that are heavily gendered are, you know, spaces that are potentially dangerous for trans individuals. And then same thing with gender expression. I'm on a camera and completely safe here in our sound studio at Trevor, but I like to wear dresses and makeup and express my gender in a lot of ways. I have very sparkly nail polish on. And that is a way that I, as a person, express my gender. But I'll tell you what, I don't always express that gender the way that I do when I feel safe and comfortable when I'm traveling, for example. I was in Fargo, North Dakota, and I had this really hard decision to make of, do I feel safe expressing my gender? I brought a dress and I brought makeup and I did the whole thing, but I was like, do I feel safe here knowing that people have made comments already about me or about the way that I look to me? And so it's something that I just want to flag for you, that gender expression doesn't always line up with your gender identity. And oftentimes that's because of safety. You just don't feel safe enough to express your gender the way that it truly is. If you have questions about that, you can add it into the chat box. Some gender identity terms I want you to take away from here. The term transgender means that you identify as a different gender than the gender that you were assigned at birth. So for example, I'm gender queer. When I was born, funnily enough, the doctor did not say, congratulations, you have a genderqueer baby. They said it's a boy, right? But I identify as genderqueer. So I fill that sort of space for myself as I'm in the trans community. In terms of transitioning, this term is often used to describe someone who is sort of moving away from the gender that they were assigned at birth and transitioning towards the gender identity that they truly have. Cisgender, this word means that you are the same gender that you were assigned at birth. And that root word cis means same. So it's pretty easy to remember if you're an SAT grammar person that root word is what gives you the heads up here. Same gender as the gender you were assigned at birth. And then transgender means different or across from, so different than the gender you were assigned. Gender non-binary, gender queer, I shared with you that I identify in this way. It means that I don't see myself in a binary way as just a man or just a woman. I see myself as somewhere outside of that system. And so I identify as gender queer. Trans man, trans woman, some people will identify specifically as a trans man or as a trans woman. But some people who might also be trans do not use the term trans man or trans woman to self-identify. They might just say, I'm a man, period, or I'm a woman, period. You don't need to signify that with the word trans. And then this term intersex, there may be a word that you heard a long time ago, and it's an antiquated word and we do not use it. It's considered really offensive, but I'll share it with you because it's important that you don't use this word anymore. The word hermaphrodite is not a word that we use. The word that we use is intersex. And so what intersex is describing is someone who has different characteristics than what is typically associated with strictly male or female. And these can be made up of things like chromosomes, hormones, genitals, and sort of any combination of that. But when a baby is born, all we're really looking at are their genitals, not their chromosomes or hormones or their genetic sort of makeup. And so lots of times when someone is born intersex, they are, you know, misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. And it actually can take years before doctors might discover, oh, actually this person is intersex. And it's fairly common. In terms of sexual orientation, we look at it oftentimes in society from three places. We look at it as attraction, behavior, and identity. So we have an attraction and we behave a certain way based on that attraction. And then sometimes we have an identity that we share with other people. So the reason why these things are broken up is that for any number of reasons, they might not connect in a perfect triangle. I might be attracted to men, women, and other genders, but my behavior is that I'm only romantic with men, and my identity is that I'm gay, right? But maybe I just don't share my attraction with the world because of either a fear of judgment or a discomfort around that. And particularly when we're talking very young people, these things are oftentimes not in this perfect recycle, reduce, reuse triangle. And the reason for that is because identities grow and we discover things about ourselves as we get older. And it makes sense that we wouldn't want to force someone to fit into this perfect triangle. And so I just want to caution you that when helping to guide a young person, you should never be like, oh, well, who are you attracted to? What's your behavior? Boom, there's your identity. Because these things are actually a lot more nuanced than that.
Can I?
Yeah.
I'm trying to unmute myself. Okay. So one of the things also is that from a young person's perspective, it's when these things are considered incongruent that they get a lot of negative feedback from adults. And I keep referring to you all as adults. I assume everybody is one. And I can say, as someone who spent their career working with young people, that incredulousness or disbelief or confusion that feels negative instantly shuts down a good conversation. And so again, I'm going to reiterate, which is asking questions from a curious place. And I don't mean just like you're faking curiosity, but actually you see if you can dig down and find some actual curiosity as a person, to ask questions that are not coming from a judgmental perspective. Because it also, when things are incongruent, and adults tend to have this immediate like rejection or wanting to place people into a category. We as humans, the way we organize information is we like everybody to fit in a neat little box. You're black, you're white, you're Asian, you are gay, you are straight, you know. And I think when people don't fit neatly, then actually it creates confusion, but also times it creates some sort of frustration and anger at times. And even if you think of yourself as a particularly liberal person, that actually gets communicated to the young person.
Um, some terms: lesbian, this is somebody who is identifying usually as a woman who is attracted to other women. But again, these things could identify maybe differently, so it's okay to check in with somebody. When you say lesbian, tell me what that means for you. Gay, this has been throughout history, more recent history at least, been used to mean multiple things. So it doesn't always just mean someone who identifies as a man who's attracted to men. Sometimes women who are attracted to women will use this term. Sometimes bisexual folks will use this term to self-describe. And gay has sometimes been used as more of a, excuse me, umbrella term. Bisexual, one thing that's important to know about bisexuality is that bisexual people oftentimes face erasure in society, this idea that they don't exist. So like, oh, if you're bisexual, you're actually just on a stepping stone towards gay. Or like, bisexuality is not really real. It's just a masking term that we use to feel safe for a little while. And I want to do away with all of that, because that's not how this works. If you're bisexual, and that's how life is. And bisexual also doesn't mean I'm attracted to both men and women, but rather bisexuality means I'm attracted to more than one gender. So I might be attracted to men, I might be attracted to genderqueer folks, I might be attracted to trans men or trans women, or I might be attracted to any number of gender identities that we had on that list of 100, right? And so it's important to know that that's where bisexuality comes in. Queer is an umbrella term that is somewhat controversial. We use it to describe our community all the time. I'm a member of the queer community. I already told you I'm genderqueer. Lots of people who identify as either lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender will also say that they are queer. It's a reclaimed word, though, because throughout history, queer has been used as a slur, right? It's something that you might have heard before you got beaten up, or it's something that you might have heard when someone was going to attack you, and as an insult. And so I don't necessarily think that queer is a term that you should use to describe someone who doesn't describe themselves that way, if that's really clear for you. So you wouldn't say, oh, if someone said, hey, I think I might be gay, your response wouldn't be like, okay, so tell me why you think you're queer, because that is not the word they use to describe themselves. But if somebody said, hey, I think I'm a member of the queer community, or I think I might be queer, it's obviously okay to mirror language there and say, you said you think that you might be queer. Can you tell me what that means for you? One term that's pretty widely accepted now is the term queer community. And that's used to describe any of these identities in some way. Asexual, so this is someone who doesn't consider themselves to have sexual attraction or sexual and romantic attraction sometimes. But the interesting thing about asexuality is that it's oftentimes erased as well. This idea of like, well, you don't have a sexual identity then if you're not sexual, or asexuality is not real, you have to be sexual. You just haven't found someone you like yet, or something like that. And those identities are oftentimes erased in our culture and society, and it's not okay to do that. The reality is that lots of people identify as asexuality. Also, to be super clear, asexual people sometimes have sex. Asexual people are oftentimes in romantic relationships or emotional relationships that don't include sex, or sometimes include sex. And so if someone identifies as asexual, let them define that for you. Don't sort of use some sort of cookie cutter definition that you think fits the bill there. And then pansexuality is similar to bisexuality, this idea that I'm attracted to all genders, or I'm not attracted to a limited scope of gender. But it's another way to say that. I'm attracted to all different genders. All right. I have a tool for you. It's a fun tool. I like it. It's called the Gender Unicorn. And this is something that's put on by the Trans Student Educational Resource, TSER. You can find it online. But basically, it's a way to explore gender and sexuality outside of a binary system. So you'll see that you could place yourself under gender identity on all three of these lines, on just one of these lines, at different places on the line. So for example, I might put myself in female, woman, girl, and I also might put myself in man, boy, male, that sort of category. It just sort of depends on the day, maybe, for me even, and that's okay. And then in terms of gender expression, I often express my gender on a more feminine space, but sometimes I would express it maybe neither feminine or masculine. And so there's space for me to place it there. Sex assigned at birth. I was assigned male at birth, but that doesn't mean I identify that way, but it's still a part of the way I was socialized. So it's a part of me. And then physical attraction and emotional attraction. I love that those two are separated out here because I'm the type of person that has a pretty narrow scope of physical attraction, but a really wide scope of emotional attraction. If I meet you and you seem pretty cool after 10 minutes, I will be emotionally in love with you. That's just who I am. But it's cool for me to be able to have ways to express that at the same time. And so I love this tool. I know I sort of had to fly through that, and there's probably a lot more I could say about it, but you'll be able to find resources online that talk through and teach how to use the gender unicorn. It's a really good tool to walk through with young people who are trying to figure out more about their identity. Tia, I've been talking so much, I want to throw it to you just so I can drink water.
Go for it. Just make it all come at the same time.
Yep.
Okay. So some of the things that we can talk about are, first, for instance, gender dysphoria. I don't know if you all remember at the top of this where I was talking about how our gender non-binary or trans youth will sometimes say, or will use our digital services more likely than our phone. So part of that is because when people are calling, they hear their own voices and they don't like what they're hearing. And so one of those things that we can talk about are feeling uncomfortable in your own body and feeling that we are not in the right body or feeling really uncomfortable with what is going on. It's funny because what my clients usually call it are gender feels. Like young people will say, I'm having gender feels. And what that generally means is that they're feeling uncomfortable, they're being triggered in some way. And it's actually important to kind of be alerted to the concept of gender feels or also gender feels is sort of like a low grade gender dysphoria, which is feeling really uncomfortable with your body or the way things are presenting themselves. I'm going to skip over gatekeeping and I'm going to talk about the whole birth name. So a lot of young people, particularly in the non-binary and trans community, do not want to use the name assigned to them at birth. And so one of the things that I want to point out is asking the question, what is your real name? Can also be really triggering for a young person. But some of the questions that come up with this is, what name can I use? Is it, should I be trying to use my birth name? And one of the other ways that young people used to talk about it, but less so, is using something called a dead name. So this is something where a name that they used before they transitioned, for instance. And I would say, Chris, that's a term that people don't use as much now, the dead name, also because the sort of association with death, which is kind of feels super negative to people. Okay, another issue that comes up is misgendering. And I don't know if people have heard of this before, which is if someone is saying my pronouns are she, her, hers, and you refer to me as a he, him, it's something that comes up a lot with a young person. Now, why do people care? Pronouns a pronoun? Well, it actually is really important for LGBTQ youth, and I think it's important for us to respect them. Ask people, what pronouns would you like me to use? What name would you like me to use? And one of the things that, as someone who runs the crisis services, I see a lot is our counselors will validate folks saying like, oh, it sounds like you want to be called Alex. Is that what you like me to call you during the course of this conversation? And honestly, just giving them permission to use the name that they chose is so freeing for the young person, and actually you'll notice an immediate drop in intensity and distress. Do you want to talk about gatekeeping?
Yeah. So gatekeeping refers to this idea that you're not allowed to identify as anything other than the sex you were assigned at birth without other people's permission. So in some states, you have to have like a therapist or a psychologist step in and be like, "Ah, yes, you meet the criteria to
Mm-hmm.
be a trans person." Or
Mm-hmm.
some states have absolutely awful laws on the books that make you go through all these legal hoops that don't make
Mm-hmm.
any sense. In California, for example, you have to pick out an ad in a newspaper declaring a name change. And so in California, the law is just anywhere in the state. So people are like, well, what's the cheapest newspaper I can find in California? And it's like this random newspaper in some small town. So I'm sure everyone in that small town is opening their newspaper being like, why does everybody change their name? Because it's page after page after page of people changing their name because this loophole makes no sense and doesn't actually matter. It's just gatekeeping. And
Mm-hmm.
so gatekeeping really refers to this idea that like you feel like you're in crisis because you don't get to own your process. Other people
Mm-hmm.
own that for you, and that
Mm-hmm.
really is a shame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Gender identity topics continued. Being outed. If somebody were to come to you and say, hey, I think I am any number of LGBT identities, and then you're like, oh, thank you so much for sharing. That can't always be easy. Let's talk about what that means for you. Let's blah, 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 blah. And then you turn around and you tell everybody about that person's identity. You've just outed that person. You've taken away their control to own their narrative and share how they want to share. And so confidentiality and promising not to out someone is an important factor here. Now, many folks, I'm assuming on this line, are mandated reporters, will have to intervene in the event that they think someone's life is at imminent risk. And that might require them to call emergency services. But that doesn't mean that when you're on the phone with emergency services, you need to be like, hi, yes, I have a gay youth in Minnesota. That may not have anything to do with their identity, and it may not be helpful at all for emergency services to know about that. And so it's something that I want to highlight, that you don't want to out this person to their parents, to emergency services, to anything like that, if you can at all avoid it. Even if you're following AAS or some sort of other accrediting body's guidelines for how to do an intervention, it's something that I want you to think about here. Conversion therapy, not a thing. It exists, but the idea that you can change somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity is completely unfounded, discredited, not real. When I was 8 years old, I was sent to a conversion therapy camp in Ohio for 3 months over the summer. And at that camp, they sort of really set a lot of established things in my mind that I've now spent the better part of, 25 years trying to undo. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that conversion therapy, that's not a thing that happens.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is sexual orientation or gender identity change efforts, people making an effort to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. But the actual therapy piece of this is bogus. There is no such thing as accredited therapy designed to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, period. Trevor, we have...
And
Yeah, you go.
Can I add in something? I think we skipped the slide accidentally, but in our national survey, over 50% of young people who have had conversion therapy efforts make a suicide attempt within 12 months of those efforts. So essentially, conversion efforts increase the usage chances of attempting suicide by 50%. Well, statistically, that's a little off, but you see what I'm saying. It's like 50% of them. And so I think asking the youth if they've had conversion efforts would be a very important factor in your risk assessment.
Right. Living in the closet. So this again talks about that idea that like you can't be open or honest about yourself. That people assume that you are either straight or cisgender as this sort of blanket baseline, and you have to come out as something. But this isn't how the world should work. And listen, I know that I can stand on a soapbox about this, but like, why not? I have a platform right now. The point is, when we talk about this idea that, well, most people in society are straight, or most people in society are cisgender, so why should we be making accommodations for such a small portion of the population? Well, with a logic or an argument like that, things like genocide happen. Things like the second-class citizenship of you name the population happen. Slavery, marginalization of women, on and on down the list. And so even if you're going to try to say, well, X portion of the population doesn't have the same level of need, or there aren't as many of them, we still should be striving to make a culture that doesn't require people to come out of any closet, because gender identity and sexual orientation are considered something that are different for everybody, and that everyone gets the opportunity to explore. We don't assume that somebody is automatically straight or automatically cisgender until proven otherwise. And so that's sort of the gold standard for the future. How do we get there?
Mm-hmm.
Exposure to HIV or diagnosis of HIV, this comes up a lot. We obviously know that there is a storied history between the LGBT community and HIV. Hundreds of thousands of LGBTQ folks have died because of HIV since the 80s. And so it's something that obviously is connected to our community and can cause trauma. So make sure that your call centers are aware of things like PEP or PrEP. Make sure that you have access to HIV resources and referrals readily available. Right, and challenges in finding spaces that are pro, PEP, PrEP, or HIV treatment. So PrEP is for pre-exposure. So the idea that you take a once daily pill and it greatly, greatly reduces your chances of getting HIV. PEP is for post-exposure. So after you've had sex that was particularly risky, you can take this within 72 hours and it reduces your risk again of contracting HIV. Best practices, Tia.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to go?
Yep.
So one of the things that I always like, this is the good part, right? Which is that if there is one accepting adult in this young person's life, it actually decreases attempting suicide by 40%. I sort of have this fantasy of going to like a bunch of churches and like mosques and synagogues and like trying to talk a bunch of older women to, like, someone mentioned mom hugs, right? Just like a bunch of older women to be like, baby, you're okay. And that's like my fantasy for Trevor, actually. I don't know, Chris, if I told you that. But if we could, you know, if one adult in their life says, I accept you, it actually sort of saves them. And so that's something that we actually like to consider. And even I think someone mentioned that, well, gosh, we want to get out into the community. If y'all could even get out into the community and talk to other adults, which is you a teacher, pastor, one of those people can save a young person's life. Great. Okay. So this is me as a psychologist, and so anybody who is a clinician will see a little bit of DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, in here. But what I'm saying here is this. We all have unconscious bias. We have implicit bias. We know how our minds work, which is like we like to categorize people. In doing this work, I think what we have to start with is ourselves. So this is me being on my soapbox again, I apologize, which is, how do you feel about same-sex marriage? Or how do you feel about two men raising children or two women raising children? Now, I know that statistically speaking, a quote-unquote lesbian couple raising children, there's basically a 0% chance of that young person actually being on the receiving end of molestation, right? I know that. Most people don't know that. And so when you want to say, is like, well, I think it's okay for a same-sex couple to raise children, but I actually think kids are better off in a more traditional family. So when you start to say comments like this, which is, I'm okay with this, but I want you to think about what kind of biases you have about folks in the LGBTQ community. And this is actually not just for folks who aren't in the community. People in the community have biases against themselves, which is, even I think Chris was mentioning earlier about sort of like folks in the bisexual community feel erased, and other gay folks or lesbians feel like, well, that's not really a real thing too. So thinking about what biases you have is the first thing that you can do as an administrator, as a clinician. And so capturing these beliefs can be a challenge. And this is from a very much CBT perspective, which is these thoughts and feelings that you have may be super fleeting and you may not have the opportunity to catch. I always go straight to the body, but your emotions, which is like having a negative reaction that you're like, catching that sort of initial like rejection, emotional rejection of information that you're receiving is a really good clue that a bias might be being triggered in that moment. And then making changes to these beliefs is essential. And I think that this is where we kind of go to the willing versus willful. I know that there are people, even if they're on this call right now, who are like, whatevs. Or who are feeling like, why would I need to do this work? I'm allowed to hold the beliefs. Absolutely, you're allowed to have the beliefs that you want, and I don't want to invalidate anybody's beliefs. But if you're going to help LGBTQ youth who are reaching out to you, you really do need to try to check your biases at the door, because when you are interacting with them or when your direct reports are interacting with them, it is communicated to them. Children and youth know BS when they see it. I don't know what it is. They're like, it's like they know who's authentic and who's not. So doing the work on yourself to try to get rid of some of your biases is essential for this work.
Okay, so let's talk some best practices. So what does help? Mirroring language and pronouns always helps. You do not want to be in the position of mislabeling, misgendering, misidentifying someone. So use the language that your caller or contact is using. Normalize exploration of gender identity, sexual orientation, or expression. If someone's telling you, I'm thinking about these things, encourage that work. Let them know that that's important work and you're proud of them for doing that work, things like that. Exploring opportunities to expand affirming experiences. So maybe they're like, I don't have anything in my school that's working for me. We don't have a GSA. We don't have any safe space. Then check and see if there may be an LGBT center in their town or an online space that might be available for them to go to. And please, please ask yourself, do I have any impulses or reactions within myself that are negative about LGBTQ identities so that I can squash those out? You have to be aware of your own impulses and address them going into these conversations. What doesn't help? Don't ask questions simply out of curiosity. So please don't ask a person of trans experience whether they've had any sort of surgery or medical procedure. If it's not applicable on the call, then there's no reason to ask about it. Discouraging or moving away from a topic of transition because you're not comfortable with it. If somebody wants to talk about this, lean into your discomfort and talk to them. Don't invalidate a youth's experience based on their age. Young people are constantly being told that their voice doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. You do not want to be adding to that course of people telling them their voice doesn't matter. If they're a young person and they're doing work on this, never say something to them like, well, when you get older, you'll figure things out, or don't worry, later, things are going to be okay. Because they're living in the right now, in the right here, and they need to know that they have the power in and of themselves and their own lived experience to start working through some of their concerns. Best practices around coming out. It's okay to explore risks and benefits around this. Ask a caller to think about what might be the best case scenario or the worst case scenario so that they are at least mentally prepared for both, you know? Engaging a young person in the setting, timing of their post-disclosure. So I plan to tell my mom on Easter Sunday. Okay, well, that might be challenging. Your mom might have certain expectations about what happens on Easter or what that looks like. Maybe your mom is very conservative or very religious or whatever. Versus I plan to tell my mom, you know, tomorrow night, because I know it's going to be a pretty low-key night where we're just going to order pizza, and I think it'd be a good time to sit her down and talk to her about this. Normalizing stress and courage it takes to come out. It is stressful, and it is a courageous act. Identifying opportunities to expand support, whether this be over the phone, in person, online. What doesn't help? Weighing in on whether someone should or shouldn't come out. You don't get to tell someone that they should come out, and you don't get to tell someone that they can't come out. It's up to them. So don't make it your position to give them heavy advice around this topic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Can I add in something here, which is that, of course, I assume most of the people here are not giving advice to young people. And I think that as an adult, I always check with myself, because I always have this idea, like, I want everybody to be able to come out. And I know inside myself, I want people to come out, right? That's just my internal bias. You'll find someone, but sometimes it actually can be quite dangerous. And I have to say, as someone who is traveled with Chris, we've consulted before we've left the hotel. Do not walk down the street. I will walk with you, or we get a group if Chris decides that they want to be able to wear a dress. And I think, we had a young person who spoke at our gala recently, and she lives in a small town in Wisconsin, and she talked about, she actually reached out to Trevor. She decided to come out. It was not encouraged by us. And since then, every time she walks down the street, people call her the F word. And she's proud of herself, and she's helped other young people in her community come out, but it has increased her risk and decreased her safety there. So, and that's just me being honest, which is like, I always want people to be able to come out, but I have to check myself and be like, okay, well, what are the potential pluses and minuses of doing so? Sorry, Chris.
Nope.
And we have 4 minutes.
Yeah, I know. That's gonna happen so fast. Don't box people in, especially if you have intake forms or you need to categorize people for demographic or data purposes. Make sure that you're giving a wide array of options in terms of gender identity. Let people tell you how they identify, and don't force them into like 3 little boxes, basically. Show off your support. If you're someone who likes the LGBT community and you're an ally, put a flag on your desk. Maybe do a fun filter on your social media. Let people know that you're someone who's safe to come to and talk to about this. And also give out helpful resources. Whatever you find that is particularly helpful, make sure you have it readily available, either to offer over the phone or to give out in person. Here's some research and national resources. We'll make sure this presentation gets out somehow so you can look at that. We have our own resources. We have a social network called Trevor Space that allows peer-to-peer interaction, and it's moderated, so it's a lot safer than Facebook or other things. These are also a list of all of our resources. If you ever want to point LGBTQ young people in our direction, thank you. We're ready and we're here to help them. And now I want to know, what are your questions? We have such few minutes, but we're going to make it possible. Tia, you've been staying on top of the chat, right? Were there any questions?
Yeah, yes. So apparently I was responding to all panelists. So if people actually have any questions that they haven't been addressed, I would love for y'all to either put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself by clicking the little button on the bottom left-hand corner. Or if you feel like this isn't a safe space for you, please email Chris or I, or separately, and we'd be happy to answer any questions in that context too. Okay, wondering what is the best way to word LGBTQ? Do we use the different versions? Chris, I'm going to let you take that one.
Yeah, so the one thing that we're all sort of getting away from is the LGBTQ with the plus sign at the end of it. We don't really use that because it sort of implies like these are the only important ones and the other ones are just like added noise at the end of this, and we don't want to imply that. So instead, what we do is we refer to LGBTQ in an umbrella way, so that the term LGBTQ is encompassing of all identities around gender and sexuality, and not just only 4 specific ones. Also, the Q can stand for queer or questioning, or both, really. So that's one sort of inclusive thing there. And I alluded to this earlier, but one way that you can refer to this is as the queer community. And I know that I mentioned that queer can be a difficult word to assign to somebody, but when we talk about it broadly as a community, it's pretty well accepted across the board now, that term, the queer community. So those are some options for you.
Great. So I think that we're right at time. And thank you, folks. Like I said, if you all have any questions for us, please reach out to us. We're super excited to answer any questions. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We'll be putting this recording up in the deck on the Network Resource Center, so you can take a look for that next week. Thank you again for the panelists, and I understand that you have a slide, I think, with some email information on there too, so please feel free to share that, and you can reach out directly as well.
Great.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.